Pop punk. According to TV Trope, the definition of it is melding the simplicity of rock and roll with breakneck speed, but maintains enough pop sensibilities. In other words, pop punk is punk rock at its most accessible. Arguably, the first ever pop punk band in this regard were the Ramones. They blended pop and fast rock to make a catchy, melodic, and simple rhythm that could appeal to many people. It has had its ups and downs over the years, but it does come back with newer bands adding different styles to their variety. Sure, pop punk hasn't reached the same commercial success in the 2010s as much as previous decades, but it is still there. There will always be a place in rock for this type of music, specifically for those who want to get into rock music but they don't know how. Pop punk serves as a perfect starting point because it is simple and catchy, and that was what was needed in the 90s. It may have replaced a certain genre in terms of popularity, but there were more similarities than what people realized. In the last video I talked about a Green Day album that slowly became appreciated over time, but there is an album that I barely touched on, which was 1995's Insomniac. The consensus for that album was that even though it was a good album, it just felt like it was treading what the previous album did, with some subtle differences. 1994's Dookie was what the music world needed after Kurt Cobain's death, which was the beginning of the end of grunge. People were looking for something lighter, and Green Day just happened to be there. There were a ton of accolades because it was fresh, fun, immature in some places, but at the same time, a complete breather from the darkness that was grunge. Green Day and acts like Bad Religion and The Offspring brought pop punk to the mainstream in the 90s. Sure, there were people who were into punk rock who thought that pop punk was too accessible and a watered down version of punk, but at the same time, it was kind of a good thing. With this appreciation for this new style of rock, people could probably go back to where the genre kind of got started. And Green Day were good for those who wanted to move on from grunge, so when their follow-up, Insomniac, came out the next year, how can one top a fresh, new, diamond-certified album? With enough time, they could pull it off. But let's go back to what I said a few seconds earlier. Came out the next year. That is not nearly enough time to catch one's breath between albums, and it does show in the final product. It's similar in sound to Dookie, except, well, let's just say there's another reason as to why this album isn't as much liked as the previous album, arguably even less so compared to the albums that came after it. Insomniac is considered a darker version of Dookie. It's a lot more bleak in terms of lyrics. It sounds more heavier in terms of instrumentation and lyrics. The subtleties are there, but they don't really stand out at first. If one distances themselves from Dookie and listens to Insomniac on its own, there is something fairly interesting about it. The reason Dookie was so successful was because it was lighthearted compared to grunge. But another reason as to why Insomniac didn't do so well is because looking at its time period, not through today's perspective, was because it was darker in tone. Pop punk was supposed to be, in 90s terms, like a prankster who didn't hurt anybody but just wanted to have fun. You didn't care, you just wanted to have fun with this person. That was what Dookie was. Insomniac is if that prankster grew up, got angry and bitter, and wants to tell everyone within earshot how they felt. The prankster is still there, but the jokes are more adult, thus more edgier. People looked at Green Day's Dookie because of its lightheartedness, but were not kind to the darker feel of its follow-up, because they wanted an alternative to grunge, not something that made them remind them of the darker tone of that genre. So, upon closer inspection, with its not as good reception when it was released and the benefit of hindsight, one could make the argument that Green Day may have made a pop-punk grunge hybrid album. Grunge has always tackled subjects like angst, boredom, and depression. It was the rebellious answer to the overexposure of hair metal, and grunge reigned for about 4 or 5 years. When it died, pop-punk came aboard with its similar subjects of angst and boredom, however depression was downplayed. It was a rebellious answer to the overexposure of grunge, and it reigned for 4 or 5 years in its initial run before being replaced with nu metal. Really, grunge and pop punk in the 90s did have something in common. They both replaced something fairly popular before it and had a very rebellious attitude that actually perked up those who were outcasts and could relate to the music. If anything, pop punk is arguably grunge sped up. And that's not to say that all grunge was slow. In fact, there are a few grunge songs that are fast throughout. Them Bones by Alice in Chains, Breed by Nirvana, Go by Pearl Jam. These songs are short, fast-paced, and they stand out in a genre that is known for having angsty songs that have softer and louder sections. And pop punk is a subgenre of punk rock, only more accessible as punk rock was more down and dirty, just like grunge. And while Insomniac is not a grunge record per se, it does have those grunge elements. Imagine if this album was released in 1992. It wouldn't stand out in any way compared to other albums, but it would fit in, albeit mostly unnoticed. One could argue that Dookie could qualify as a grunge album because of these themes. However, its follow-up is more closer because while Dookie has this punk rebellious spirit, Insomniac's spirit is more grimmer and angrier, just like grunge. In fact, you could argue that one song from Dookie has grunge elements. Longview. The verses are a bit on the softer side, while the chorus is loud and crunchy. It talks about a topic, masturbation, in a delinquent way, perhaps a grungy way? And if the song was played at a lower key, it does sound like a grunge song. But maybe I'm speculating about this. A lot of people write off this album because it has been overshadowed by many of their major releases, especially when Dookie is considered a landmark album, Nimrod and Warning have been highly vindicated by history, and American Idiot is a classic example of a career resurrection. And despite some claiming that they have not distanced their sound from their previous output, it does do it subtly. There are lyrics that talk about dissociation, methamphetamine use, taking your anger out on someone, rejection, and one waiting for parents to die so they can collect their inheritance. The topics here that can be used in a grunge song are pretty much here. The anger is more noticeable at this point, and it's not an act. The band themselves were labeled sellouts because they signed with a record label to put out a pretty popular album, and the seething of this is scattered everywhere here. So despite this being possibly the weakest album in their 90s catalog in terms of major releases, one should go into this with a mind that Green Day tried their hand at grunge and mix it up a bit with their pop punk sound. If they had more time with it, the album could have stood out outside of Dookie's shadow. An album this dark was not needed from a band that was lighthearted for the most part. This seems like a problem in 1995. It might have been the wrong time for angry pop punk music, but who knows? It'll have its reappraisal in the future.